Welcome to the interview series on the socioeconomic consequences of disruptive technologies by Rethinking Economics NL. In this interview today, we will be focusing on the governance, bias and ethics of disruptive technologies, especially AI. This is a topic we've already discussed a bit in the previous interviews, but never had a chance to go in depth to. And for that, I'm honored to be able to interview today four of the foremost experts on this topic. Firstly with us today is Kay Firth-Butterfield. She is the head of artificial intelligence and a member of the executive committee at World Economic Forum, and one of the foremost experts on the governance of AI. She is a barrister, a former judge, and a professor, a technologist and entrepreneur who has an abiding interest in how humanity can accurately benefit from new technologies, especially AI. She has co-founded AI Global and was the world's first chief AI ethics officer in 2014 and created the AI Ethics Twitter hashtag. Kay is the vice chair of the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations on Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems, and was the part of the group that met at Asilomar to create the Asilomar AI Ethical Principles. Secondly, with me today is Wendell Waller. He is an internationally recognized expert on the ethics and governance concerns posed by emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and neuroscience. He is a scholar at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where he chaired the technology and ethics studies for 11 years. He is also a senior advisor to the Hastings Center and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council in International Affairs. He is the co-author with Colin Allen of the book More Machines, Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, which maps a new field of variously called machine ethics, machine morality, computational morality, and friendly AI. His latest book is A Dangerous Master: How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. Thirdly with us today is Renee Cummings. She is a criminologist, criminal psychologist, and therapeutic jurisprudence specialist, AI ethicist, and AI strategist. She's the founder of Urban AI, a community scholar at Columbia University, and a founding board member of Springer's New AI and Ethics Journal. Renee is also the historic first data activist in residence at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. She is on the front line of ethical AI, battling bias, discrimination, algorithmic injustice, and advocating for a more accountable, transparent, diverse, equitable, and inclusive artificial intelligence. Renee specializes in AI for social good, justice-oriented AI, AI policy and governance, and using AI to save lives. Lastly with us today is Celeste Kidd. She's an assistant professor at the assistant professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, where her lab investigates learning and belief formation. The Kidd Lab is one of the few in the world that combines technologically sophisticated behavioral experiments with computational models in order to broadly understand knowledge acquisition. She's also focused on ethical tech. Her work on ethics in AI and technology has been featured in opening keynotes at NeurIPS, the World AI Summit, at Boston X Tech Talk. Kidd was also named one of the Time magazine's 2017 Persons of the Year as one of the silent speakers for her advocacy for greater equality, diversity and inclusion in higher education. Now, the first question of the day I have for Kay. Could you tell us more about governance in the context of AI and why is this such importance?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you today, and especially with my esteemed panelists who I know well, especially, of course, Wendell, who I have known as long as I've had any dealings with AI. So thank you. So governance, why is it important? Well, I think that we sort of started way back it really sort of thinking, should we be thinking about super intelligence? So back in the old days of 2014, we were thinking with Nick Bostrom about super intelligence, and then DeepMind sort of sold itself to Alphabet, and suddenly we were also talking about what it meant to have deep learning and machine learning, and the problems in that field, as well as superintelligence. And it does seem to me, although there are many wonderful scholars still working on superintelligence, that actually the conversation around governance has moved more to the areas that Renee deals with so well, for example, in bias and fairness and accountability and transparency of algorithms. And so why is it important? Well, it's important because we need to have the conversation around bias, obviously. We want to make it a technology that serves everybody. So we need to think about how we make it beneficial AI, and how we think about fairness, transparency, accountability, explainability. In fact, we borrowed from PwC their work where they looked at the, I don't know, 175 different principles or 190 different principles. And they found that actually the world is concerned about 10, whether you're in Beijing or Bombay, whether you're in Berkeley or Boston. Everybody is concerned about these 10 issues. And they're all things that we should be thinking about in terms of governance. And those that I just listed were some of them. And companies need to think about governance. So, we bring a lot of companies together at the forum. And at the moment, we're bringing them together to think about governance of AI. If they are going to use AI, how are you going to make sure that it serves the needs of society and it serves the needs of their customers? And society and their customers may be different, especially if they're B2B companies. And, maybe the big technology companies, they're working on this. But if you are a smaller company, perhaps working in advanced manufacturing, and you're going to be using robots with your human beings or AI to track your human beings for safety concerns, for example, then you need to really be thinking about how you think about governance using AI. So, I could go on for the rest of this talk, but there are more the better than me on this conversation. So we want to hear from them.
Yes, I think it is also very interesting. You, Wendell, were basically already working on this before it was cool, basically, I think. Yeah. So if I have a very short follow-up on that. So what for you are the main ethical considerations? I think you already quite alluded to that, and how do you also have examples on how we can actually solve these? Well, solve is of course very difficult, but what can we do at least to tackle them?
Yeah, so I think I said some of the 10. I will add in robustness, security, and resilience as one group, and safety, and of course diversity and inclusion, which Renee works on so well. And I think that it's important that we can call them ethical principles, and certainly someone like Wendell, who's an ethicist, can better call them ethical principles. But I have actually started talking about them as just problems that my stakeholders, companies and governments, are going to have to solve if they are going to use artificial intelligence. And sometimes just tweaking the language a little bit makes it just more acceptable.
Wendell, could you expand on that? So what are for you the main considerations related to governance and ethics of AI?
I'm going to answer your question by first posing another question, which is whether AI systems are going to be employed in ways that enhance equality, or will AI systems exacerbate existing structural inequalities and create new inequities? The biotech and digital revolutions so far have been winner take all, and at least the trajectories we've seen so far exacerbate inequality. Is directed at specific challenges in the attempt to ameliorate this imbalance. But I think we also have to see that they are relatively weak tools, and they're often being employed for ethics washing and to mollify criticism in the midst of this transformative inflection point in human history. In other words, I don't think we're really addressing the moment in human history that we're at. Those of us who have good intent are trying to approach it through principles and through specific egregiances, but is that robust enough? To date, I don't think there's any means to address the tech revolution comprehensively. Furthermore, we're in the midst of a coalition of the tech oligopoly and anti-big government forces and security industry that will work hard to ensure that we don't really have a robust response to the imbalances that we're perceiving. And meanwhile, we're all experiencing that our societies are being destabilized as citizens increasingly question whether the tech revolution is really in their interests, whether governments can solve their problems, or whether this bio-digital revolution really serves the elites and those who aspire to be in the elites. So I think what I'm saying here is we need some form of effective international governance of emerging tech. But so far, there's little evidence that we're going to get it.
And you already alluded to this a bit, but could you also expand on some other disruptive technologies, biotech, and do you see these as the main technologies we should be worried from an ethical perspective about? Or how do you see this for the upcoming decades and currently?
Well, biotech and the digital revolution are clearly the two most powerful forces, but nanotech is coming along. We have geoengineering, we have a vast array of other technological possibilities, and we have tremendous uncertainties about when the breakthroughs will occur, how these technologies will converge with each other, so what synergies will take place, and therefore what will occur as we walk down this bio-digital revolution. I sometimes put forward the rather melodramatic possibility that perhaps we've begun inventing the human species as we know it out of existence. So the interesting thing is that when these various committees convene to create principles to try and guide the unfoldment of AI, I think they also understood that we weren't just talking about controlling or managing artificial intelligence per se. They understood, at least intuitively, that we're in the midst of a broader inflection point and a much more extreme possibilities and uncertainties than we have traditionally managed. And so when they came up with lists of principles, only a few of those principles were AI specific. Most specifically, the FAT principles: fairness, accountability, transparency. But they also had many other principles around human rights, around protecting democracies. Those principles weren't always universalized. In Beijing, for example, the Beijing principles did not include human rights. Instead, they included the time-honored Chinese principle of harmony. It's not that the Chinese don't embrace human rights. They just don't want the human rights they embrace being defined by the liberal democracies in the West. But the point I'm trying to make here is I think there was an understanding that we aren't just dealing with these specific problems that are AI specific or digital specific. We are truly at a moment in history where we need values, we need a kind of universalized goals, or we are going to disintegrate into warring factions and nationalist movements that have no interest in internationalism.
I think the work of René quite beautifully introduces and challenges those aspects. Could you expand on that? And especially what for you, René, are the most important issues surrounding ethics and bias, and then especially of AI, but also perhaps the other technologies raised?
Thank you so much, and certainly an honor to be in such distinguished company. I think at this moment, what we're seeing is the issue of data rights. And I think data rights is going to be the civil rights movement of this generation. And you're going to see data activism activism coming into its own. I think people are waking up and waking up slowly to the fact that their data is not only being monetized, but being weaponized against them. And we're seeing that more and more within the context of criminal justice. When we look at algorithmic policing, when we're looking at the risk assessment tools being used for sentencing, when we're looking at corrections and how corrections is being digitized with algorithms. And now to get your parole, you've got to face an algorithm or a risk assessment tool again. So that question of AI and how it is re-administering the ways in which we think about justice and the ways in which it is informing, or the ways in which it is undermining at times due process, has people really thinking about it. So we're seeing that whole question of algorithmic decision making. Who's making these decisions? What's the data being used to make those decisions? What's the level of bias baked in to that data? And we're seeing the question of diversity and equity and inclusion, not only as a risk management strategy from design into development into deployment, but we're seeing the questions now of representation and visibility within the context of who is being disenfranchised and disempowered by this technology. And what we're also seeing is this plethora of mass surveillance technologies, the ones that we know of and the ones that we don't know of, the things that are being designed that we have got to be very vigilant about. So this whole concept of the algorithm now as the police officer or the undercover police officer, or in policing, we're seeing the algorithm now as the informant. So these questions, when they come into the criminal justice system, are making people question coding. How do we code justice? How do we code equity? How do we code risk? And when we're seeing questions, how do we code what it means to be a person of color? And these are the questions that people are starting to ask. So it comes back to trust. And the biggest question about AI is going to be, can we trust it? How legitimate is this technology? So public confidence and public trust around concerns of accountability and transparency and explainability. People are starting to question these things more and more. And now we're seeing AI having this extraordinary power to assault something like truth. What is truth? And that is going to be a big question, because we have seen the disinformation campaigns, and we know that we have not experienced the real moment of a deep fake. And it's something the criminal justice system is very concerned about. What can find its way into evidence? What could be used when it comes to this technology to take away somebody's liberty or somebody's, life? So these life and death questions within the context of criminal justice is going to make us stretch our imagination as well as our ethical imagination when it comes to understanding the power of this technology. So I think criminal justice is really a great spyglass into the question of data rights. And people are going to want to be represented, and people are going to be very concerned about how their data could be weaponized against them in real time. So it's going to call for a different kind of consciousness. It's going to call for a new kind of vigilance, because what we're seeing is that question of algorithmic justice really coming to the fore. And then once we are now in this space, we're going to have to ask ourselves, how are we going to deal with that? Because what we have seen would be the regulations and the frameworks and the codes of conduct and all the different, ethical material that's out there is really not serving the moment, because there are some big questions that need to be answered. And I think we're going to also see much more honesty in the kinds of questions. And really, we're going to see some answers that are going to make us very uncomfortable as a society as well.
I think that translates quite beautifully in the work of Celeste. But before we go there, I also had a short follow-up on that. So this is an issue we're also facing in economics, but I think especially in the tech sector. Why is there such importance that not everyone, to put it quite bluntly, looks like me, young, white male? Could you expand on that as well, Renee?
Oh, certainly, because in society, everyone does not look like you. It's about bringing that sort of eclectic cosmology to the work that we do. And when I speak about imagination, I would say that AI is undermining its own imagination if everyone looks like one thing. So what we're seeing is diversity, equity, and inclusion really playing a significant role. And we've heard over and over this concept about who's at the table. But I think what AI can afford us is a radical rethinking in real time of that table, because now everything is virtual. So the table does not have to be physical anymore. So we can get the diversity and we can get the inclusion and we could ensure the representation is there, because I think the beauty of this world is its diversity. And I think with diversity is what has given us the world as we know it, the creativity that we know it, the solutions that we have seen. And I think AI as a solutions-driven technology would want to ensure that there's that diversity of intelligences in the space.
So that's, could you expand on that? And I was especially curious on this topic also quite closely relates, I think, to the way we form beliefs and the way that we learn. And could you tell us how that especially relates to the topics of Renee and also AI ethics, bias, and the importance of diversity?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I have a lot to say about why the group of people that make all the decisions are a homogenous group, and I think it does tie into biases in people, human psychology, and also the fact that biases in AI systems of the type that Renee described, ones that are making very serious decisions about whether or not you will ever get to see your family or you will stay in jail for the rest of your life. Those systems, we know now there is quite a bit of biases, racial biases, gender biases, class biases built into those. Sometimes it's the data set to blame, but not always. There's lots of ways that an algorithm can be biased, despite this. I see this myth increasing over time. I was like, the idea that an algorithm is more fair than people is just false. I think the most important thing to consider in the immediate and distant future is the fact that biases in AI systems that are interacting with people are going to strengthen and reinforce biases that exist in people. You create a giant language model that's using language from people on the internet that have all kinds of biases, because who has access, who is writing, who's producing that content is not as diverse as people in the world are. If you create a tool using that data as the training set, you're going to pick up on human biases. But then if you're using those in order to make recommendations and add on top of that the popular perception that AI is infallible or it's more fair or something like this, a human using that tool is going to pick up on the biases of the AI system. And in many cases, it may actually strengthen them. So there's far more examples than we have time for today, but one simple one that is related to your first question about why is the room so homogenous, the room that people are making these decisions in, why is it all why doesn't it look like people in the world? You look at AI tools for screening job applicants. Both Amazon and LinkedIn have been caught with their tools doing things that they claim they didn't realize they were doing. That is totally plausible. That doesn't let you off the hook. It's like I'm actually more concerned that you didn't notice for years that your tool was doing that. Both of their systems were eliminating women and Black candidates on the basis of things like the colleges or their names. If you are a job recruiter who is using those systems, and you in your head think like, I want more diversity in the people that I hire, but I just don't see any. They just aren't any women in this pool. I would love to hire a woman. That would be super great. But there aren't any. That's a great example. We've all heard that before, and that's a great example of the AI system having had an impact on the human using its perception of who is qualified. Like that, the AI in some case reinforced these already existing human biased and discriminatory perceptions that there aren't certain people in the room because they are inferior or because they don't want to be there. When we know, as like when you look more carefully, they couldn't be farther from the truth. It's hard to break in for a group that's underrepresented because they're always going to be fighting against the bias that if there are people that are not represented here, it's because they're not capable of doing it, or they don't want to be here.
What I was also very curious about is how this relates to some associated and related technologies, such as social media. Could you expand on that as well, what you consider to be the main issues there?
Sure. Yeah. So that's an issue that I've talked a lot about, and my lab works quite a bit on. AI systems have largely replaced what used to be human gatekeepers of our information. But unlike the human systems, something like the Associated Press, that are people that share human values, automated systems generally operate in ways where what they're doing is maximizing engagement. That on the face of it doesn't seem like a bad system. You're going to offer people stuff that they're likely to engage with, whether that means click or comment or just kind of hang time. The problem is that humans use these systems to make up their minds. And what I can tell you, human psychology in a nutshell, is that people make up their minds very quickly and on the basis of rather superficial information. So if you are not sure about something and you go online to try to make up your mind, and you're offered content that is selected not on the basis of what's true or what's important, like an editor would select when deciding, what's the cover story today. If you're offered stuff that is selected to maximize your engagement, there is a real risk that you're going to see a relatively homogeneous group of opinions in close succession that also is probably selected to be more fringe or more salacious, because that's what people find interesting. There was a cool recent paper, it's still a preprint, but showing that it's not what is true that determines whether or not people share stuff. Stuff that's true is not always interesting. If everybody knows it, there's no purpose in sharing it. The best predictor they found of what is shared online is what would be interesting if it were true, which is totally different. So the fact that people are going to these systems, they're depending upon these systems to go from unsure to making up their mind is problematic, because we also know that once somebody has made up their mind, it's really hard to get them to reconsider. We have mechanisms in place that are designed in order to keep us going and moving and looking for new stuff. So we seek information when we're uncertain about something. We sample just a little bit of it necessarily, because you don't have infinite time or attention. You make up your mind, and once that's happened, even if we in the lab have paid people to continue looking at information, it doesn't count in the same way once you're sure as it counted when you were unsure. So those first pieces of information you offer people are very important in setting them on a path to have a certain belief. And you combine that with the biases that we know are in the system, and it's a recipe for disaster if there's not a really high level of scrutiny and regulation on these things.
I think it also very interesting relates to some of the things we are facing in economics, such as that we often work from the assumption of perfect rationality, and thus that, well, people are perfectly rational and able to assess all the information perfectly. But it might be something to come back to. But before we do that, I would love to also return to Kay and Wendell. So what I was very curious about is how you are seeing, both of you are seeing these issues. And I was especially curious on the socioeconomic consequence of these very important issues, but also what we can actually do to alleviate, at least create less stress through these issues. And perhaps it's best first for for Wendell and then for Kay. Wendell, could you start?
Yes, I certainly can. And I first want to just comment on the fact that when you look at the four of us, we're all approaching these issues from very different perspectives, or very different levels got accentuated. And that's really the challenge we're dealing with, is how are we going to approach this from these many levels, but ensure that overall we are actually redirecting the trajectory of these emerging technologies, and whether we really can pull that off. I mean, I think the verdict is still out in that regard. So now we have these challenges from social media, we have these challenges in algorithmic bias. Those are what are on the table today. I think those have become the primary entry points, and Renee is totally correct in that algorithmic bias and data rights are going to be the entry point for most citizens to reflect on what we're getting involved with. Whether what we're getting involved with is going to be some kind of national surveillance or surveillance capitalism, or whether in effect we do have trustworthy systems and people can feel comfortable with what they're working with. It's the same thing that we're seeing with social media now. I think we all understand how social media has totally disrupted society at large. There is a principle that was first put forward by David Collingridge in 1980 that is referred to as the Collingridge principle. And he said that it's easiest to govern, it's easiest to direct the unfoldment of a technology very early in its development. But oftentimes early in its development, we don't understand what the problems are. By the time we do understand what the problems are, it gets so deeply entrenched in our society that it becomes very difficult to alter that technology. And social media have become the classic case in point, that we did not fully appreciate what we were getting involved with social media. And now it's so big and people are so dependent upon it that really altering its trajectory or ensuring that it does not undermine democratic societies, or at least widespread public participation in its social processes, that's becoming very difficult. I think what's fascinating about this moment of history, and interesting enough, I was on a call with somebody else who was involved with the World Economic Forum, Nick Davis, yesterday. And Nick Davis was just saying, so in response to the kinds of things I've been bringing up, it is so you're saying, or perhaps we're in this sweet point in the Collingridge dilemma, where we're beginning to appreciate the downsides of technologies, and we still have the opportunity to address them before they are fully entrenched. We will find out over the next few years whether we are doing enough.
I think that quite beautifully goes to Kay. And how do you see these issues? And I was also curious on what kind of things should we then be implementing to address these issues?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much. And I agree that I think we're at a point where if we can address it correctly, we can go forward beneficially with AI, but we are at that tipping point or sweet spot or whatever people call it. I just wanted to, I will get back to the question, but I wanted to just riff off some of the things that others have said. I think that diversity of teams that that Renee was talking about is terribly important. And I was sitting here thinking about it, and I jotted down my team. I have Canada, Japan, the Republic of the Congo, India, New Zealand, Brazil, the United States, Colombia, Turkey, France, and me from the UK. So I think that that one of the steps we should take, and my partners should take, is really looking at, who is in your team, and is it a diverse team? In the World Economic Forum, we need to have people from everywhere, and especially the Global South. And so, your question is, what's going to be good and bad? I think the Global South is an area that I worry about on an almost constant basis, how we can make sure that we lift everybody's boats using AI. And to Renee's point about data, we know that there is insufficient data, and what data there is in danger of data colonization. And so we really need to be careful about how we work with the Global South. I actually have 4 offices plus India, which I don't quite count as the Global South, in that area now. And I'm trying to work with, for example, IADB, which works across Latin America and the Caribbean, to really think through what is governance of AI. And one of the things that worries me, but I think could be a positive, is that a lot of countries and companies, for that matter, see AI as some sort of holy grail. We can cure corruption with AI. Well, maybe we can. We can educate the world with AI. Maybe we can, but not unless we put in these foundational governance principles. And so that's really, what we've been working on. And also, I think we need to get ahead if we can. So I have a project around AI in space, because if we're going to go to space and we're going to use AI in space, let's not wait until it's happened to us. Same with AI ethics and quantum. So I think that there is some areas we can still try and get ahead a bit, and some things that we really need to work on now. And so you asked me specifically, what's the good and the bad? Well, I think, I talked about the Global South. I also think that inclusion is hugely important, and Renee can talk about that more eloquently than I. But we do have a couple of projects on those high-risk things, actually creating governance tools. So we do actually have a project with the government of the Netherlands, the police of the Netherlands, looking at use of facial recognition and law enforcement with Unicry and some others. And also some work around how you think about using, if you're going to use an AI tool to hire, what governance tools should you put in place? Because much as I would like to shut the stable door, the horse is already bolted, and we've got to deal in real time with these things. I think that access to the benefits of AI for people with disability, old people who are going to somehow be forced to use. I know Wendell and I have had this debate or discussion that old people are going to be forced to use AI. What about their privacy? What about their rights? And how do we make that a good experience rather than just palming our old folks off into AI-controlled robot homes? Young people, we have a lot of work. We do a lot of work around how do we make education with AI safe. And I think it's been sort of mentioned, but possible civil unrest coming from the dramatic problems that we're seeing with social media. And then just going back to something that Renee said, I am, as you know, a barrister and judge by background. I still belong to Doughty Street Chambers, which is the human rights chambers. And, one of the things that worries me is when I hear countries say, oh, we could have AI judges. And so I will leave it at that.
Well, I would love to hear what Celeste and Renee are thinking of this. And I would also be very curious on what will be most important for students in economics, where we especially aim to educate through this series on disruptive technologies. Perhaps considering the content of your answer first, Renee, and then Celeste.
Thank you. So I think we are going to look more and more at the question of decision making, algorithmic decision making, because everything begins and ends with a decision. Who's included, who's excluded, who's empowered, who's disempowered. And more we're seeing that these decisions seem to be somehow in favor always of a particular group, a particular constituency, a particular demographic. And I think what has happened because of this pandemic, how it has affected resources, how it has amplified disparities and inequities. People are paying attention because of the fact that we have so much less, many of us, than we had before. People are paying attention. And I think people want to know about those rights within the context of the fact that we know the data in itself is an infrastructure as well as a structure. And it's just not an economic structure, it's political, it's cultural. And when the political, the cultural, and the economic combine to disenfranchise certain groups, people are really going to want to know how these decisions are being made. So you're going to see more and more challenges when it comes to the data that's being used. And people are going to sort of travel through the stream of consciousness of the data to the fact that how does things like colonization and oppression and imperialism and all of those things have historically impacted the data that we're using, because we're seeing a continuation of the data. I mean, and there's something that I look at, and it's really something very new, which would be the transmission of intergenerational trauma through data. And we're seeing that because of the fact that these algorithms are widening the wealth gap and really not closing it. So it not only comes to the algorithm as a decision-making factor, but the people who are designing these algorithms. So this is why I keep saying it, that we're going to have to see a more robust literacy when it comes to understanding AI. And we're going to have to see from an earlier age, maybe from kindergarten, a building of an understanding about AI ethics and a building of ethical resilience. Because I think we understand that we're in a stage right now where people are in a place of sort of like scarce resources. And when resources are scarce, I think people get a different kind of understanding that really speaks to the fact that, somehow I think people are looking at big tech and they're saying, but, how did big tech get so big and on what? And it's coming back to people that they got so big on something as simple as your data. And we have not received 1 penny of those profits. And this same data is now going to be weaponized in many ways against certain groups. And it really comes back to that whole question of what is governance and who is this governance for and who is it about and who is to benefit from governance and who's defining what ethics is. And I think people are going to want to be represented. So we're really going to see more advocacy, more activism. And I think what has been left out of the conversation when it comes to AI would be the voice of the people. And I think people are really waking up to the fact that something is happening. And then there's that other challenge of media, not only social media, but we're seeing many pilots are now coming out there for films that are going to create more distrust around the technology and how it's being used. And you're going to see the disinformation in social media. You're going to see questions being raised by Hollywood about this technology. And AI in itself is going to have to not only represent itself, but ensure that among it, all groups are represented.
Celeste, could you expand on these topics and not what Renee raised, but also what Kay and Wendell said?
Yeah, so I want to go back to something that Kay said about AI judges and people thinking we should have AI judges. Renee gave several examples about AI being involved in making decisions about who's at risk and who's not for parole. We already have AI judges, and the fact that a lot of people don't understand the biases in these systems is like don't understand that these systems are already in place. It's like that they're being sold to facilitating these kinds of decision making should be scary and is something that we should consider. The fact that a lot of these systems are proprietary, and so there's not a diverse group of people who get to examine them and question how they work and call attention to biases that they may be better prepared as humans with diverse backgrounds to detect than someone else in the room. This is one of the reasons why you need a diverse group of people working, especially in governance, but also in developing these tools. The fact that they're not under scrutiny is terrifying. This is not an AI judge, but I mentioned AI taking the place of gatekeepers for our information. This is something that Renee brought up, and also what Wendell said about like not realizing the problems until they actually come to light. I think this example is a good one. In 1972, during the Vietnam War, the Associated Press ran what is now a very famous photograph of a little girl in the streets surrounded by her cousins, and her clothes had burned off. She's screaming because of napalm. That photo was published in the context of Nixon very openly talking about the problem that journalists were posing for people supporting the Vietnam War. He was openly talking about how can we stop them, how can we go after them, and it's very easy to see how that photo could be characterized as child pornography. That photo was, if you are looking at the nudity and you're considering just the privacy considerations, was not something that they would normally run. It's not something that they ran lightly. There's a whole backstory about why that photograph was taken. The photographer thinking that he was from that village, thinking that this was important, that people know about this. He pushed for this photo to be published despite the personal risk to him. The photo editors that fought for there to be an exception made and for this photo to run also did that because they had human ethical considerations. The newsworthiness of the photo, showing people what was going on and how awful it was, took priority over even their personal risk. So like the risk of them going to jail for the rest of their lives because they ran a photo that could be characterized as child porn. That photo ran, and it's famous now because it's credited with galvanizing the American opposition to the war. Fast forward several decades, the anniversary of that photo, there was an article in a Dutch newspaper about this photo and how important it was. It was posted on Facebook, and it was immediately automatically tagged for containing nudity, and it was not allowed to be presented on the platform. When the higher ups at Facebook were questioned about this decision, they stuck by it and said, like, our policy is no nudity. So sorry, but that contains nudity. Wendell brought up us being in a relatively early stage of considering all of these issues. That's where we're at right now. We don't have a better system. The Associated Press and journalism in general is a field that has a very well thought out set of ethical principles that journalists hold each other to. There's also some history of it wasn't always that way, and there's laws and regulations that pushed the humans to more carefully consider some of the ethical principles, things like equity and representing both sides. We're not there. We're not there with social media yet. It has entirely replaced it's like the role of editors in determining what we see and what we don't. And again, I'm sorry to be using the word terrifying so often, but it's very scary, and it's something that we need to consider more deeply than we have so far.
To ask you a very short follow-up on that, and something I already also alluded to earlier, was the concept of perfect rationality that many economists work from, and we often start with in our model. And of course, your research shows that this is far more complex, and I think the story which you just told us shows us as well that the world is not perfect, and or assumptions or models do often assume that. So I was curious, what do you think that in or the real world are the main divergences from perfect rationality, that things work perfectly, and especially that people work perfectly?
Yeah, so there, anybody who works on the law or who's worked in philosophy or who works in psychology knows that there's different ethical principles that sometimes come into conflict with each other, and it's unclear how they should be weighted. It depends a lot on the particulars of the circumstance. Our systems are not capable of handling that nuance right now, and that lack of ability to handle that kind of nuance, to distinguish between an image that is circulated for nefarious purposes with the potential to just harm a child or harm another person versus something that has historical importance, news value. The fact that the AI systems are now filtering out what humans get to see, I worry is a problem. What are we missing out on? There's a case where it was caught, and we know what we missed out on, and we only know that we missed out on that because the newspaper that was censored raised a flag and said, like, "Hey, this doesn't seem right. Can we call attention to this for a moment? Can we talk about this?" If it, how many other cases? It's like, are we missing important information that we need to know about? How many other images that have the potential to be that important, or are we not seeing? And the answer is we don't know, because we don't have access to that, because the systems that are making these decisions are proprietary, and that's one area where I think there's a clear space for regulation. There needs to be some supervision. Too much is happening behind closed doors where we don't get to scrutinize it.
So I think that we don't have that much longer left before we move towards closing questions. But before then, I was hoping to still ask Kay and Wendell a question for everyone's closing statements. I was very curious, how do you see the comments made by Renee and Celeste, and especially in the context of what will be most important for economists to know about this and to be able to contribute to helping all these enormous issues? Perhaps first for Kay.
If I can find my unmute button. Yes. And also many apologies for the fact that I think you've nearly seen all of our animal family on this podcast. Most important for economists, I think, a sea change, basically. So we have a project called the Positive Futures. And in it, we bring together sci-fi writers, economists, business people, governments, etc. And Wendell's probably been to some of those meetings. And what struck me the other day at our most recent meeting was that we were with Daniel Susskind, who's an economist. And when he wrapped up, he said, nobody likes any of the traditional models that economists run. We all want to see change. And I actually think that that's the most important thing for economists, that maybe the models that have been used are not the models that the future calls for. And I know that, it's incredibly difficult to look at one's profession and say, well, how does this change? But I think that that's the place that that economists need to be thinking about, because our economies are going to change. Our economies, we could say, have already changed because of the amount of money in crypto or the amount of money in technology companies. The balance of power has changed, probably between companies and countries. And so, so the economic models need to change for our future as well.
Wendell, how do you see this? Do you perhaps have examples on what we should change in this context?
Sure. I think it's clear that we're in the midst of a distribution crisis. And the pandemic has perhaps underscored that, in that those who control capital, meaning any of us who have stocks, though obviously a small group controls most of the stock portfolios in the world, they're actually doing remarkably well and making a fortune in the midst of this pandemic, while the vast majority of citizens around the world are living lives of desperation. So I think economists have to start from the fact that we are in this distribution crisis, and the present systems that we have in place are not solving that, they're making it worse. So how do we nudge, or how do we shape the digital economy, the biotech economy for the next generation in a way where we rewrite that balance, that we establish some degree of trust with the public, that the economic structures in place are going to serve their interests. Now, a lot of things are being discussed, such as guaranteed incomes. I think that's part of the problem, but that's probably not sufficient. So economists have to start from the fact that we now have economies in place that were built, let's say, for the 20th century, not for the 21st century. That those economies and throughout the 20th century, an increasing percentage of wealth went to labor and not merely to capital, though capital grew significantly. But now we're in an era where there is a decreasing percentage of productivity gains going to labor and an increasing percentage of productivity gains going to capital. And that can be illustrated in a very simple way. For every robot that replaces a human job, all of those productivity gains go to the owners of capital, those of us who own stock, and none of those productivity gains go to labor. And that's clearly the trajectory for any economy that is looking at efficiencies or maximization of profits or maximization of GDPs rather than the benefits that accrue to citizens at large. And perhaps one of the things we need to be considering from the governance perspective is how do we address that? So what's come out of Renee and Celeste very prominently has been this need for inclusivity. We live in a world that governance was dominated by men with property. And in a certain sense, we are still in that world. And men with property, consciously or unconsciously with biases or for economic, psychological reasons, will want to reinforce that system. One of the main tools they have for doing it today is AI systems that lack transparency. And as AI systems get more and more complex, that ability to bring in transparency is going to be more and more difficult. So Renee is correct when she points to data. It's the data sets that allow the recreation of those inequalities, the recreation of a lack of transparencies in what are pushing this distribution crisis forward. So I think that's the remit for the economists.
I think that's a beautiful way to almost end today. I think that we can now, if still possible for everyone, move towards the closing statements. So we always end with the same question each interview, and that is, if there's one thing you could say to students in economics watching today, related to the topics we discussed, what will that be? What is your take-home message? And I think it will be best to do it in the reverse order of the initial question. So first for Celeste.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that everybody is coming at all of these questions from very different backgrounds, but we wound up on a similar point, which Wendell, I think, wrapped up beautifully. Inclusivity is really important. Who has the power? Who has control? Who has the knowledge of how these systems work? And if it's not diverse, it's really important to ask why and for there to be a priority. It should be a priority for all of us in the interest of equity to work on ways to fix that.
I think it's also beautiful to see that you are all coming from such different angles, but indeed reach the same conclusion. I think it also shows the importance of an interdisciplinary approach. So then for Renee.
Thank you. I think for our students of economics, the question is really going to be algorithmic economics is going to really move to the top of the agenda. I think they're going to start to think or rethink how do we code in this moment bread and butter issues, because they're going to have to come up with a new code for that as well. I think they're also going to have to start thinking about a new economic formula for collateral damage because of the long-term sociological impacts of technology on society. And I think what they're also going to have to think about would be economic power as defined through algorithms.
Wendell?
I want to say a bit more about this question of inclusivity, excuse me, and how it enters into economics. To the World Economic Forum's credit, many years ago, it decided that its panels were going to be at least equally divided by gender. And for the first few years, they had real trouble finding enough women. That wasn't because there weren't enough great women out there, but it was difficult for women to come to the attention of those in the leadership role. And to applaud you, this is one of the first panels I've been on that we have 3 women and 1 man, and 3 brilliant women. I'm constantly encountering more and more brilliant women. I think that's just a demonstration of how we can move forward if we give people opportunity. And the economic challenge is really, how do we distribute that opportunity? How do we ensure that the global South is represented, that people of color are represented, that people, that those who are going to be affected by the decisions have a voice in the decision-making process? That's what we aren't really seeing yet at the top rungs of economic decision-making. And that will be the challenge for economists. Now, let me say one other thing before I sign off, and that's the role of behavioral economics right now, which is playing a somewhat pernicious role in demeaning human faculties and helping with a narrative that is aggrandizing that of artificial intelligence, even though artificial intelligence has not achieved these great milestones that are being put forward. And it also plays into a narrative that intelligence is individual, and therefore if the machines can be smarter. No, intelligence is not individual. Intelligence is collective. And intelligence has evolved through the collective input and the diversity of peoples. So in the future, we need to be thinking about how to create decision-making processes in which there is much broader engagement as we work through these really difficult challenges. And yes, there may be seats at the table for robots, but they have to be collaborator bots, not systems that lack transparency that we defer to because there is the illusion that because they can win a game of Go that they are smarter than the other inputs at the table.
I think it's a beautiful statement. And I also, is indeed something I really strive involved to have a diverse and inclusive, not only the panels, but especially the interview series itself. Kay, for you, the very last words for today.
Yes, certainly. And so really everything that I have to say builds upon the words that everybody else has said. But obviously, economists need to think about equality and inclusion. And, you know, Wendell mentioned the global south, but I actually think that we are seeing massive economic divides in many countries. And so we need to be thinking about how do we solve that? Because otherwise we can see war and civil unrest in our future. I think that just as we are saying in terms of stakeholder capitalism, economists need to really think of human beings, as do companies, as human beings rather than as assets or not assets, which can be replaced by robots or AI. And so I guess I should end by saying, you know, my chair, Professor Schwab, came up 51 years ago with this concept of stakeholder capitalism. Maybe its time has come and we value people and the society that is impacted by our companies as much as we value what the companies can do.
It's a beautiful statement. I think a perfect way for end today. Thank you so much again for making the time, and we hope to see all of you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.